Welcome everyone as we just get up and running here, almost ready to get going here. Thanks. So Cody, why don't you let me know as soon as you have the live stream going, we'll just we'll kick it off, all right?
I think we're up and going, so go ahead, kick it off.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. Really happy to be here with you all again. And thanks for joining us for our fourth Technical Advisory Committee meeting for the Walkable Design Standards Model Code project. So we're going to dive in today to best practices. I think this is a really natural next step in terms of what all we've been talking about. I'm hoping to set a little bit different of a rhythm today. We're hopeful it'll be about 50% of us sharing information and 50% of hearing from you all. So a little more facilitation today. Today we're going to cover really just the best practices. That's all we have on our agenda today. We're going to give you a little orientation as to how we'll talk about each of them, but we're going to be covering 5 best practice topics, and you should have all seen those as an introduction in the memo we sent ahead of the meeting. So there's flexible frontage, connectivity, compact urban development, urban landscaping, and climate parking lot design. And then we'll end the meeting with just a little bit of information about where we're going next. So why are we looking at best practices? If you all remember this, it's an image from one of our earlier TAC meetings. So when we look at current approaches across jurisdictions, there's some that are often and similar. There's some that we found that were sometimes and varied. And then there was that far right-hand grouping of rare and specific. And so we wanted to tease out some of these that people are doing both within the state, but also across the country, and look at some best practices specifically to address some of the issues that you all have raised. And our hope would be that we look at these best practices, unpack them with you all, and arrive at some guidance in our guidebook, which will shift that balance so that these best practices are more commonly used. So how will we be presenting those to you today? I was like a little roadmap of where we're going to go. So there's a set of slides, and you'll see this content for each of the 5 topics that we're going to look at. So we'll open with an issue, and that's really, it starts with a problem statement, and that is formulated based on the input you all have given to us. So what about your standards isn't working for you now to meet the CFEC intent? And also some graphic examples. So I always like to see what's a built result. You know, what is being built to the standards, but it's not the outcome that we're looking for. Next, there'll be an intent slide, and that will frame what is our intent and a new approach. So what would a better way look like? How would we know we're meeting that with a new standard? So that's some level setting up front with you all. And then for each best practice, we're going to propose an approach. We'll explain to you at a high level. Now, there's a lot of details in here, but we're going to try not to get bogged down in all the details. We're going to keep it higher level. What's a new approach that we would propose? And then there'll be a secondary slide after that, which lays out some of the pros and cons to help you start to think through what would or would not work within your particular jurisdiction. So I do want to note, we want to try to really tease out from some of our smaller jurisdictions what would or wouldn't work, and some questions that we always come back to when we're looking at a best practice to think, would it work, is our evaluation criteria. So I just want to pause and remind us all of that. So would this best practice be clear and objective? Would it get better quality urban design outcomes? Would it help us achieve those goals of increasing housing and transportation choice? Would it have more equitable outcomes, more inclusive, accessible communities? Would it be easier to implement or to administer? And then is there some flexibility to this, right? We've looked at a bunch of different contexts or place types. So is there some flexibility to use this best practice in those different place types? And then lastly, that impact on development cost and feasibility. So I'd ask you to think, how would a best practice affect that development cost? So a lot of things to hold up our best practices too, but I think those are really helpful questions to think about. So our objectives for today's discussion, just to help you know what we're planning to do, is we want to share out that information at a high level on relevant best practices. And then we really want to stop after each best practice topic and gather input from you. So, what would work or not work in the context of your jurisdiction? Maybe there's more information you need to know. So there's something that's intriguing, but what else do you want to know so that you get a better sense of what that approach really is? And then please, by all means, if there's another best practice that you think is relevant, or a specific place that you think really shows this, please share those with us as well. Okay, so if there's no questions, I'm going to dive into our first best practice topic. So flexible frontage standards. I think I just want to note that this is a topic that cuts across a lot of different standards, right? We had talked about transparency, entry orientation, build to lines. But fundamentally, I think the issue that came up for us that we heard from the TAC is you could have all those standards in place, but they're all structured in a way that is trying to front load a massing along a street and create that as a proxy for a pedestrian orientation. But having that street wall, even if it has windows and doors in it, may not be enough to guarantee a lively public realm or an adequately sized public realm. So our intent would be an approach that creates more flexibility and more emphasis on that public realm. So a standard should allow a creative design, and it's not just that building wall, but it could also be welcoming and comfortable spaces, such as this image you're seeing on the screen. So there's a flexibility and a range of the types of spaces that are going to create that enjoyable pedestrian orientation. And as we'll show here, that could include flexibility in use requirements, in terms of setback or that building frontage requirement, and also how it's met. So the first best practice that we want to put forward is looking at defining commercial uses more broadly. So let me unpack this for you a little bit. This is looking specifically, first, it's not across an entire zone. This is something that we helped develop for the Halsey Main Streets, which is in the city of Fairview and a couple other cities along Halsey Street. So it's not the entire zone. It's a specific storefront zone that's defined within the commercial mixed-use zone. And so there's that 50% ground floor commercial requirement that we see so commonly, but it's only in that focused node of storefront zones. And there's some built-in flexibility. So how do you meet that 50% requirement? It doesn't have to be with the building. You could use some flexible spaces such as this food cart pod or a micro retail space, and that would meet your 50% ground floor use requirement. Now, it is supported by some elevated design standards so that there's some assurance as to what that pedestrian plaza or micro retail space would look like. So some pros and cons that we see to that as a best practice. It's definitely more flexible, which allows for markets that may be not as strong to support that ground floor requirement, another way to meet it still. It's promoting some local businesses or entrepreneurs, right? Those smaller spaces could give somebody a footing. And when it's supported with those baseline minimum designs, we think it's really adding to a quality public realm. Now, some challenges may be, it may be more difficult to administer than one of your more typical frontage standards. And it may be a complex code if we're only applying it to a handful of sites. Maybe this is something that if we're looking at our variance allowances, we could get the same type of results from. So we put these pros and cons out here to sort of pique you to start thinking, but we're really interested to hear what you think about it. So I'm going to walk you through one more best practice around flexible frontage standards. So this is City of Beaverton example up on the screen, but it's looking specifically at linking your frontage requirements to some key streets. So what you see here is City of Beaverton mapped out and defined a street typology. And so these black lines up here are the street typology. Now they layered some additional standards on top of that. So the percentage of the frontage is calibrated to that street type. So if you're on a really critical street here, like that loop street in the dark black line, more frontage, up to 90% frontage is going to be required. But if you're fronting one of these other slightly less important streets in their hierarchy, not as much frontage would be required. So 50%, 60%. Similarly, there's the calibration of the active ground floor uses. So the most active uses with the most people coming and going, again, are keyed into those streets that are the highest in the hierarchy. So some pros, it's really concentrating those frontages and activities in those key areas. It is doing it mostly through building frontage. It's more of a form-based approach, right? It's emphasizing that street wall, but in some key places, and it's linking that to where these key public investments are, right? So downtown Beaverton's putting an enormous amount of investment into some of these streets and remaking them to be a really excellent public realm. So it's putting that use and building all together in that space. They may be more difficult to administer than a typical build to line percentage. They might be more challenging for an applicant, right? If you need to meet different frontages and different uses on different sides, let's say you have a corner lot, that's definitely more challenging. And it is really, again, putting forward that building frontage as a proxy for active public realm. So we're and actually, I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to give us 30 seconds to a minute to just jot down any thoughts or questions you have and give us a second to compose ourselves before I hand it off to Alex to ask you some questions. So I'm just going to take a pause here for a minute.
Well, this is Paige. I'll just jump in and say that I really like this idea of the flexibility. It does support the transit bus stop infrastructure concept that I've been expressing in terms of that kind of conflict between zero setback and allowing for that space that we need when there's a transit facility. So I think that this supports that concept.
Great, thanks, Paige. Pauline, I'll just jump in and maybe frame up some of the critical trade-off questions we want to make sure we've got clarity around, which is, as Pauline mentioned, the kind of more recent iteration of this idea of frontage standards has been really focused on bringing more of the building mass closer to that zero lot line front. And can focusing on active uses that are activating that front area, even if the actual physical front of the building is set back a bit, right? Like is shown in the image on the left, right? Is the flexibility that can accommodate uses rather than the physical form of the building being up to that zero lot line? Does that define the public realm enough, even if there's a bit of a setback? Does that use requirement and allowing that flexibility? So that's one of the trade-off questions. Steve Bryan's hand.
Hi, everybody. Ryan Martin from Beaverton. Good to see our map on there. It's possible that could work. It's also possible that folks could propose a interim condition to avoid the permanent condition of a building, and then remove that. And you have a building, either less building along the fringe than you'd hoped, or buildings set farther back with nothing in front of it. I don't know. I'm just processing that. I did read the memo, but I'm just kind of processing this. I'm trying to figure out how, if there's a higher risk that you would not get the public realm you want if you allow these temporary uses to count.
Yeah, and I should say I don't think we're thinking of them as temporary uses. I mean, in the specific example Pauline mentioned, you could have food carts as an element of this use-based activation strategy in a setback building, but it's not necessarily permitted as a temporary use. And I think to just crystallize the trade-off here, I think one of the things that this strategy is trying to respond to is the feedback that we heard early on with the TAC that if a building, if the result of a zero lot line frontage standard pushes the building way up to the front, the actual space that's left available becomes equally difficult to becomes difficult to program because it's quite constrained. And so is that strategy, is the risk of having too constrained of a pedestrian activation area equal or lesser to having the ability for that front line to move back and create additional flexible space? Well, so I'll shut up, and I can't remember I don't know the order.
Let's,
Here.
why don't we have Ryan jump in first?
Great, thank you. So we have standards kind of like this in Corvallis, and I really like the flexibility that allowing sort of outdoor space to count toward that frontage provides. But I'll just kind of try to articulate some challenges that we've run into here. One is kind of defining how deep does that outdoor space need to be to count toward the frontage occupation. This is the standard that we have here. So 10 feet, 20 feet, does it need to occupy the whole maximum building setback or something more than that? So kind of defining that. And then if you are using a building facade to count toward that frontage, how close does that need to be to the sidewalk to count? Does it have to be right on the sidewalk? Can it be set back 10 feet, 20 feet? Also here, we have a requirement for utility easements across the frontages, which is a real challenge in most of our city other than downtown. Downtown, you can put the utilities through the alleyways behind buildings, but outside of downtown, in most cases, we're going to require a 7-foot utility easement across the front. And are there alternatives to doing that? I'd love to hear some best practices on alternatives to locating that franchise utility easement across the frontage so that we can allow outside of our downtown storefronts to come closer to the sidewalk.
Thanks, Ryan. Let's have Skylar next, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. I lowered my hand because Brian covered my comment already, but then Alex, your response, actually want to politely push back a little bit on the food cart piece, especially because, a commercial space that's built for commercial activity meets commercial code. It is by use, defined for that usage. Food cart pods use open space that's paved. And our code treats food cart pods as temporary uses, but beyond just the code itself, by nature, they are temporary uses. So I think what Brian's bringing up is a valid point that someone could say, we're going to build this food cart pod to meet our frontage standards to activate the pedestrian environment. Maybe they even have it up and running for 3 months, decide it doesn't work. They don't have to re-tenant that space with food carts. They could just leave it as open plaza, and suddenly you've got a dead pedestrian environment. And I think that runs counter to what we want to see in these areas. So I'm not opposed to the idea of food carts helping to meet the frontage standards. I think there just needs to be some very careful thought about the permanence of that use and how you can account for that through other trade-offs, right? That you get some flexibility elsewhere, but if you suddenly don't have this use, you lose that flexibility.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, Pauline,
sorry, go ahead.
just really quick. Just to give a little window into the trade-off discussion that was had out on the Halsey corridor, we had much the same conversation, and I think ultimately the trade-off, the decision locally was to err on the side of the risk of a Class A retail space that's required as a result of frontage standards being quite expensive and being out of reach of tenants, compared to the flexibility of the market responding with that, or with a food cart, like broaden the menu of costs, rents that would be feasible within that ground floor plane. And that was like a pretty motivating objective for them locally. But I totally hear what you're saying.
And just quickly, I know there's other people that have their hands up here, but I think you can partially get at that by requiring less depth in the commercial space, that you can require just like almost a veneer of commercial frontage with very shallow spaces that allow for maker spaces, but they are permanently commercial development. Thanks.
Thanks, Skylar. I just want to make sure before we move on to Phil, Eunice, I saw you had your hand up. Is there anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, everyone basically had already said it. So in Salem, in our mixed use zones in downtown, it's a 0 setback, but you can go up to 10 as a max if you basically do some sort of public amenity, pedestrian amenity. That could even be an extended sidewalk, because many of our sidewalks are not great to walk along. So if you can get a little bit of extra space, that's beneficial. Our challenge has been defining. They're like, well, could I put some grass and maybe a couple benches? Does that count? So I think we need to kind of tighten up what that looks like. And then to Ryan's point, we are struggling also with the PUE. A lot of our utilities are requiring a 10-foot PUE. How do you make that work is our question.
Thanks. Okay. Phil, why don't you jump in here?
Whoops. I turn on my video and then turn it off. Just adding to Eunice, we also have a flexible setback, a minimum and a maximum, which gets at that a little bit. I did want to mention regarding the food carts. I mean, Portland kind of allowed food carts during sort of the Wild West aspect of food carts, and we're potentially going to look at making some refinements to that. But we have traditionally called those vehicles. So you're parking a trailer in a parking lot, and so kind of getting at Skylar's point. That worked really well when we had existing parking lots downtown being, converted to food cart pods, especially when we didn't have a lot of other infrastructure requirements. We're starting to get the infrastructure requirements, but there could be an issue, like Skylar was saying, that, the food carts aren't successful. It's just not marketed well. You have a paved area, and then from a Portland perspective, that would be considered a parking area, and it could convert easily back to a parking lot, which we're trying to get away from. So I wanted to point out one of the things we did with our design overlay zones, with our standards and the menu approach, was if you do have a plaza, then that the building is still kind of framing that plaza, and that there's some main entrances to either tenant spaces or to say the lobby of the residential building that accesses off that plaza, which is another way to potentially at least provide that interaction and a link between the sidewalk and the building. So I was just going to kind of throw that one out there.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, so I'm going to make space for Anne as our last speaker, but otherwise, if people have other comments or questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. But go ahead, Anne.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with what folks just said. I was thinking maybe the model code could just add a commentary or consideration that if you want to consider temporary active uses, to just things to consider, that you may need to have a backup plan or condition that if it, this goes away, that it becomes a plaza. And that could also be a relationship between the percentage of building frontage, the minimum that you have. I mean, if you have a minimum that's more than 50%, maybe it isn't as big of an issue. But if you only have 50%, maybe it's more important that, and especially because of the food cart has been the example, if that went away, assurances that it's not going to become a parking lot and that it still remains an active, usable pedestrian space. It might just be a consideration for local jurisdictions to consider in the code, model code.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, I'm going to move us to our next topic. And again, feel free, if there's any questions you have or additional things that would be helpful for you to know about these, please feel free to share that with us. So Our next topic is looking at connectivity. So a really important objective in the CFEC regulations is to introduce that porousness, connect grids, make more ways and easier ways for people to move through spaces and to destinations. But mostly how that's handled now is in maximum block standards or requiring certain connections to be made. But as you all highlighted for us, roads are costly to build and maintain, and they may not always be, frankly, the best connection in terms of ease and safety of movement. So that's the issue as we've captured it. Now, in terms of our intent, what would be a better approach? Again, an emphasis on flexibility, but encouraging these frequent smaller scale connections that are really prioritizing the movement of people walking and biking rather than getting around by car. And those would both still break up those larger blocks, make those connections more frequent, and offer that ease of movement, but really focused on who's using them and how they're moving through that space. So I'm going to highlight two best practices here for you. So looking at some flexibility in how those maximum block length standards are set. So setting them differently for a vehicular scale versus a pedestrian scale. So here you can see a block that's over 700 feet long in Northwest Crossing in Bend. But rather than requiring a road to break up that block with a maximum block length standard, there's a pedestrian path. And you can see it here on the screen. This looks like a really comfortable way to move through a block to this key destination of a park, right? You could put your kid on their strider bike as they're learning how to ride, and it's a really comfortable and safe connection, and it's breaking up that larger scale block. So it'd be allowing larger blocks if these more frequent pedestrian scale connections were provided. Now, there's a lot of existing exceptions for this that we've seen in codes, but it's really just making sure that that's a little more common, easier to use. So pros, it does have that flexibility in block layout. It makes it a little easier, less constraints for a large development project. It somewhat sidesteps this issue of that public versus private road and who's maintaining it. It's a path. It's not nearly as expensive to maintain. And we do see this as being able to be adapted to break up those super blocks long term, so more in existing urban fabric, the redevelopment issues. So some cons, there's always this constraint of fire code and access and how wide that path has to be. So we still want it to be, safe, comfortable, small, not too expensive. And I think, it's always important to note that really, this mostly comes in at land division or really large new projects. So this is still an incremental approach to that connectivity. So looking totally differently, a best practice would be to focus on connections at a network level. So mapping out your connections citywide, and a lot of cities are doing this, really linking up their plans and their policies to map out what are future connections. And so that means that there's a policy guidance when an application comes in that's where you want those future connections to be, and it's laid out and connecting to your streets and your trails and your bicycle plans. And you can even be linking it then also to future projects and investments in that those networks. So pros and cons. I think to me here, I actually start probably more from the cons. This is a large undertaking for a smaller jurisdiction to take on. There's some issues of proportionality that are raised in terms of what you can require any one applicant coming in to provide in terms of creating those connections. And again, it's really being often done on a more limited basis through those land division. That's where the regulations of land use come in here. But I think that idea of thinking at a network scale and connecting, across, not siloing, but thinking across different departments to reflect those future visions, future plans, and applying that citywide lens when we're looking at an individual project can be really helpful. So same thing here. I'm just going to pause for a little bit and let you collect your thoughts or questions before we jump into discussion. Ryan, I see you have your hand. Are you ready to jump in?
Oh, sure. Wasn't sure if I should jump in or
Yeah,
wait to be
that's okay.
called.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Go
sorry.
for it.
Yeah, just reiterate what I've said before. I think I really like the idea of using pedestrian paths as vehicle block faces, and allowing those or pedestrian blocks to count as blocks effectively. That's a direction that we've gone in here in Corvallis. One thing, and it's, sorry if you can hear a train in the background here. One detail that this may be too kind of in the weeds for this, but that train is really loud, sorry, is where that pedestrian path intersects with the streets, the vehicle blocks or vehicle paths. One thing we did not do here is, or we required the pedestrian path to be like a multi-use path width. So that suggests that cyclists will also be using it, but we didn't require that when those intersect with the streets that there be a ramp or any sort of actual connection to the street network. And so that might be something to think about is if you're going to be requiring these paths to be wide enough for bicycles, how are those cyclists actually going to get onto the street when they get to there?
I see Brian dropped a comment into the chat. Sounds like you're sort of doing some investigative work on your TSP for ideas like this. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to share about where you are and that could be useful here.
Thanks, Alex. It's still pretty early, but it's definitely part of the work. So we're excited about exploring that. I mean, we don't even have a cross section for an alley in our design manual right now. So it would be great to have a kind of a palette of options that folks could use in the future.
Enos, go ahead.
Sorry, my computer's being glitchy. I was just gonna say, based on a different conversation yesterday around low car, no car, streets and districts and how that kind of interacts with this could be an option of doing something similar to this, and also meeting the intent of that rule.
Steve.
Just quickly, I would echo the others in that I do like this option. Another thing, I think just the comment on the previous slide was talking about fire access. One thing is to also just use the emergency bollarded fire access that might not otherwise meet spacing requirements as the pedestrian connection. And so you can kill two birds with one stone. I definitely agree with the comment, I guess, to the second question about the nexus, is that this really works a lot better with greenfield development. And I think just in general, this is going to be a problem going forward for cities, especially as some more of the case law develops going forward in time to not have this just become the responsibility of the city.
Yeah, understood. Great. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions? Does it seem, maybe I would ask Prod some of our smaller jurisdictions in terms of how feasible this seems within your context. Yeah, Kevin.
I'm sorry, I can't resist jumping in. So a couple places I've worked, Eugene and Corvallis notably, had different issues with these kind of pedestrian connections. The Eugene Mall was a great idea back in the 70s. However, the way it was designed, there were a lot of narrow corridors that weren't visibly accessible. And so over time, it got a little shady downtown. they wound up opening up the streets. So, you know, having eyes on these areas, I think, is important from a safety standpoint. That's kind of hard to mandate in clear and objective terms, but something to think about. The other issue I've seen is some of the public-private question of how you design that access. Sometimes people are uncertain, like, can I go through there or not? And so, you know, how you tackle, you know, that issue, you know, with visual cues or even signage is something to consider as well.
Thanks, Kevin. Derek?
I was just going to add kind of on what Kevin was saying in terms of signage, particularly is I think as these develop and are successful, you're sometimes going to see signage issues where your sign code regulates a street frontage, but this is as a pedestrian connection somewhere where unless you regulate it properly, you're going to get a proliferation of signs. You're going to have A-frame signage obstructing the pedestrian path. And you're also going to have businesses wanting to bring outdoor seating into this. And I think those are all things to consider.
Great, thanks. I hadn't thought about it in the context of next to businesses, so appreciate that thought. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to move us to the next topic then. So this is picking up where we left off at our last TAC, looking more specifically at compact urban development. And so I think what we had laid out for you all and walked through and talked about the details of is there's very often these existing development standards in zones that have unintentional barriers to meeting the CFEC goal of compact urban development, you know, allowing that amount of intensity of use and of people that would support transit and create these vibrant urban or just vibrant places with a lot going on in them. And so we saw at issue these development standards that limit the number of units within a building, and that becomes the limitation, rather than setting a building form and allowing more flexibility within that building form. So really complex issue, a lot of relevant development standards, but we're going to try to lay out for you just two higher level approaches or how to think about this. So I think we would propose, our intent would be, in order to better meet that goal of compact development, change of the focus from the number of units to setting a maximum building envelope or a maximum massing or built form, and then not limiting the number of units within that to get rid of those barriers and allow more of that type of compact development to support those neighborhoods that CFEC is seeking. So we're looking at two specific best practices here. We would say first, we tried to create two really strong distinctions between them to tease out some of the issues. So the first approach would be look at setting a building envelope. And this is using both those 2D and 3D standards that we talked about. So you define that envelope using a maximum height and minimum or even maximum setbacks to define that building envelope. And you may want to push and pull that envelope to calibrate it, given the place type that you're in, right? It might be a smaller purple outline here. But within that envelope, you would remove that maximum cap on those number of units within it. So you'd be setting a built envelope, and then you'd be allowing flexibility for the market to respond within it. You know, there's some other tools here that you'd want to think about in those different place types. So in terms of, right, there's the minimum lot size or lot coverages that would also affect that envelope and might be creating some barriers. And then also we talked about in specific markets trying to set minimums to push the market to go a little bit further and make sure we're meeting those housing goals. So we wanted to look at these in the context of a block. And I think we'll be looking at this further in the guidebook, looking at guidance on how to use this approach within those different place types. So, but it's helpful here to just look at if we set that building envelope and there's that max, it's really the 5 stories here limitation that's setting that building envelope. So, benefits is removing those unintentional barriers that are limiting the number of units. It is more flexible, and it may improve feasibility of some projects, and it may be easier to administer. Love to hear from you on that. Now, it is allowing more units overall, and really some of these constraints are true for either of these approaches. So again, that gets to, it's going to take a lot of work to build the support around allowing those more units. Some concerns that we often hear about those units might be around, planning adequately for infrastructure or for, parks and schools. So we're so used to using that number of units that there's some fear if we don't have that unit in there, that count, it may be harder to plan. And I think, and either of these approaches really need to be supported with adequate design standards to address that building massing. Now, we do want to say that without those minimum densities, you may have some outcome where you're allowing a large amount of building envelope, but not requiring as much of it. So we really would think that there's some places where it's really important to have that minimum density included to make sure you're pushing the market. So a slightly different approach would be looking at setting the building massing. So defining the massing and allowing flexibility within it, and using floor area ratio to do that. So same thing, you're going to want to calibrate what is that building massing given the context, and not just the existing context, but what your desired future context is that you're building toward. And again, removing that maximum number of units that might be a cap. So I think things to consider would be looking at if you want to support that with a height. So you have a certain amount of massing, but for example, maybe this one of these you don't want to allow, and because it's too tall, and you'd want more of a spread out form. So then you'd want to introduce a height as well. Same thing, you might want to set those minimums to push the market. And so one of the things that became apparent to us is when we're looking more at using just that building massing instead of an envelope is you may be introducing or allowing more flexibility and range of built forms because there's not quite as many development standards being applied. You're saying, here's your floor area you get, and you can move it around the site in different ways. So again, similar pros and cons, it's more flexible, may improve feasibility. I think it may actually open some stuff up on some infill lots and promote more variation in form. But I do think a lot of thought is needed in terms of how to set that FAR and what design standards need to be put in place to really address how massing lands on the site, particularly in relation to neighbors, usually the neighbors behind the building. And I do want to note also, if we're going to set maximums around how much development can go on a site, it's important to think through those maximums and make sure you don't just set it at the upper limits, because if you want to apply or overlay any incentives on top of that, let's say you want to ask for more public benefits, you want to make sure that you've got a little bit of wiggle room to hand out that additional density or intensity of use. So you want to set that maximum really thoughtfully. And this is something I know that City of Portland has spent a lot of time thinking about in many of their zones. So a lot of content here, and I don't think we're going to land on all of it today, but would love to just start to tease out some of your thoughts and ideas around this in sort of a post-density approach to development. If we take that density limitation or number off the table, what does that mean? So again, pause and take some time to write down any questions that you may have or thoughts you want to share. And then Alex, feel free to jump in whenever.
Well, everyone either loves form-based code or they hate it. So Brian says it's a pretty common approach. That's so completely removing unit count either from a lot or a per acre basis is a common approach. That's not been our experience. Even in form-based code approaches, there usually is a lingering dwelling units per acre, or even in some of the more purist iterations of it. So
Yeah, I
I'm
would-
curious to get some
it
perspective.
hasn't necessarily spread to as many residential only districts, but it's a very common approach in mixed use districts. And those buildings often don't have a lot of commercial in them, so it's kind of the same idea. It's really all in the calibration and sometimes design, depending on kind of how much FAR you're allowing.
I'll just jump in this time if that's okay. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the infrastructure. I mean, from a land use perspective, I like this. I don't have any issues with this. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I do already hear the Public Works Department yelling at us saying, how can you how do we know? How do we plan for, how do we size pipes down this street if we don't know how many units it's going to be serving? So if the best practice has a good discussion in response to that ahead of time, that would be helpful.
And I would say, I think
go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead, Alex. Well, I was gonna say, I think
go.
this is a question for jurisdictions. You know, some of this is in areas where there's a really strong market. It may be enough to sort of remove some of the barriers and get out of the way and encourage that compact development. But I would really push on, again, some of our smaller jurisdictions, thinking within your market conditions, or given, you know, your local appetite and support for increasing development in zones. You know, what about this seems plausible and what seems like maybe too much of a stretch?
Eunice, you had your hand up. I want to hear what you had to say.
I mean, I don't know if it's Salem specific, but I think we still have minimum densities, and we actually have a mixed use zone where we're proposing to establish one where we don't have one, and it's a lower minimum density, 15 units per acre, right? It's in line with CFEC essentially. Because I'm not sure in some of our zones that might be smaller lots. If we don't put a minimum density, we won't just get a big single family, which is not what we're going for. So I can see on bigger lots, maybe, you know, people are building way beyond 15 units per acre, which is great. And we don't have a max density in a lot of our mixed use zones. So it's just basically height. That's it that we really, but I'm a little like kind of nervous about some of those other areas.
Age.
So not a land use planner here, but in terms of density to support transit, I mean, certainly we look at density overall. We're not necessarily trying to find, you know, a specific lot that has higher density other than another one. We are already committed statewide, I believe, to go into any of our CFA areas with transit service. So I think providing this flexibility is good. But some context with that is I have had a lot of experience with planned unit developments over the years and seen some kind of tricky things that developers like to do with phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and over, you know, a 10 or 15-year period of time, they can change drastically from what they initially submitted to the city. So I could see where this might work for like a lot, you know, a parcel, but I would be a little leery about applying this opportunity for variances for a planned unit development, because it could make it so that you're, you know, essentially creating an area that's neither pedestrian friendly, transit friendly, bike friendly, and it's just, you know, economically it makes sense for the developer. So I'm not sure if there's a way to sort of sidebar how this gets applied, but I think with the PUD, it could get messy pretty quick.
You jump in.
I definitely think the utility conversation is an interesting one for sure. As a city that has a lot of commercial and industrial, I mean, we definitely still find that like there's a lot of unknown about what land uses might actually be built in an area. And so I think to some extent, I don't know, maybe my friends in engineering will beat up on me later, but I feel like it's a little bit, I mean, there is some planning that needs to be done, but I think that that's maybe a little bit of an overwrought concern. And that there could be some cases where a city's public utility like capacity might not allow for something to get built until infrastructure is upsized. But conversely, what we hear from our sanitary sewer district is they don't want to build sanitary sewer pipes in capacity until they're sure development is going to happen. And so, I mean, there really is this kind of hand in glove relationship, regardless of what is going to be developed. So, I mean, I know that there's like a concern about like going away from densities, and maybe there does need to be, when we update our utility master plans, a more careful study of these climate friendly areas to kind of like do a pro forma look at what might develop to better understand what our like 20-year needs for the area are. But I guess I mean, it feels kind of like the same conversation came up in missing middle. Like, I don't know that many jurisdictions really actually did the utility exemption anyway. And at the end of the day, found that it was not as big of a deal as they maybe perceived initially that it would be. And then I guess the last comment that I had was on the question in the chat about step down setbacks. And I think I feel like, no, they're not necessary unless you get really, really tall. But I think like what we're talking about in smaller city, you know, outside of Portland, suburban context, even in the Portland metro, we're talking about like 5-7 stories max for development. And so I would say no. I mean, I just thinking about like an area where the urban context has changed quite a bit, like Capitol Hill, Seattle, where they have a lot of like pedestrian oriented commercial and street activation in new development, which is pretty rare to achieve. It feels like they have a lot of 5 to 7 story buildings that are right at the like back of the sidewalk that make it work. So, and I feel like that's maybe what we're aspiring to here.
Thanks, Steve. And a great point about getting some of those lessons learned and looping back in those conversations around utility from missing middle, because you're right, there's a lot of thought was put into that, and now we've got some you know, some outputs, so that's helpful. I think actually I'm going to use your helpful transition into our next topic, which is landscaping, because I think some of that will maybe get to some of these concerns around those 5 to 7 story buildings and how to fit them into their context in a compatible way. So at issue that we looked at last time is, well, if when we look at those built outcomes of those more compact forms, larger scale buildings, often we're still applying you know, fundamentally a very low density landscaping standard to those. So we're looking at very often current approaches look at requiring a minimum amount of space, and it's just a placeholder somewhere on the site. Some amount of space needs to be provided as landscaping, but there's not necessarily an emphasis on the quality of that place, making that a usable space. Looking at making sure that where that space is on the site, that it enhances the quality of the urban area and improves the walkability of the realm surrounding it, and is a more livable environment, both for the people, I would say, that live or work in that building, and the people that live or work in that neighborhood. So our intent for a new approach to better handle that would be a compact development landscaping standard that is focusing on those usable open spaces that are visible from the street and that are enhancing that public realm. So they're making a better public realm experience, kind of like as you can see here. And there's room for active spaces, as well as I think we need to note that functional or that performance quality of a landscape in terms of the climate concerns here. So capturing stormwater, reducing urban heat islands, so the landscaping, we're going to ask it to do a lot of things. So how can we do that? What are some of our best practices that we're looking at? I'm going to walk you through 3 here, but they're fairly similar. So the first would be allowing, if there's a common open space requirement, you're allowing those common open spaces to meet that landscaping requirement, but they could be, for example, on upper story. So it could be that a courtyard counts toward your landscaping requirement, even if it's that common open space, but it could also be a rooftop garden or a terrace. And they may or may not be required to be accessible to the public. So here's an example in this first image of a large new apartment building in Seattle. It's got this nice courtyard. It is behind a fence. It is at the front of the lot. Does that meet our goals or not? I'm not sure. There's some pros and cons there that we'd like to talk through with you. So, I think there's some benefits here in terms of improving development feasibility, making it easier, better outcomes for landscaping, but they're again not as focused yet on that pedestrian realm and really improving that walkable experience. So it might be helpful to have a larger menu of defined usable spaces. So that brings us to our next best practice, which is looking at allowing publicly accessible open spaces that are on the ground floor level to count toward that requirement. So that could include something like this example on the far right here, which is sort of an internal plaza within a building, but it also cuts through the site. So it's publicly accessible, it's still on the private lot, but it's adding benefit both to the people that live there or people who live in the neighborhood and want to walk through that space. It could also include additional space that's provided in the public right of way. So in this first example here, it could be a wider sidewalk or landscaping provided within that counts toward the site landscaping requirements. It would be important for those improvements to fit into some sort of overall streets plan or make sure they're meeting the standards, advancing some goals for that public realm. So pros and cons here. I mean, I see these are really chances to provide usable open space at that ground floor. They're probably not just a window dressing, right? They're not just a buffer along the front of a 0 lot building or along the side of a parking lot. And even these small spaces, even if they're not a large linear space, they can have a really big impact on how someone experiences that building. And they're also increasing the overall space that's allocated to the public realm, right? As has been pointed out in the chat, sometimes the sidewalk's only 6 feet wide. So this can really help address that and make it a more robust public realm. Now, on the flip side of that, by requiring that wider space, we might be reducing the overall leasable area that a developer has to work with. And so we may need to consider some type of offset there in terms of giving back something for what is being given to the public realm. And again, I think it's important to have support this with street plans or standards that are really bringing the overall public realm up to a certain level of quality. So lastly, I just want to highlight for you a unique approach, and this is specifically done in Seattle, and it's green factor. So it's a points-based system where there's a menu of clear and objective ways that landscaping can be provided on site. And then those points are allocated or weighted, I should say, based on value. So for example, if there's certain things that are more important, so a visible landscaping along the front of the site, that'll get a higher point value. Trees that has a bigger canopy, that has a higher point value. So different zones are given a different point level that you have to hit. And then those values can be balanced within a zone to really get at some key goals. And that landscaping in the public right of way is one of the ways that you can get some credits. So a lot of flexibility here, really emphasizing that public realm aspect and contribution of landscaping to it, and building in some more of the climate considerations. However, I'm sure it's more complicated to administer. And there have been some issues raised that maybe some of the points or the value needs to be weighted more heavily to building that tree canopy. So it's not, that's more of a finer con point though. So pause here with these really lush images of some open spaces in Seattle that meet these standards, and sort of posit if we could have a much more flexible and new way to think about open spaces in an urban setting. And I see we've already gotten Skylar excited. So feel free to jump in, Skylar.
Yeah, sorry, this is a near and dear one to my heart. So a couple of things. I really like the points-based system. I think, especially if the state were to have sort of a menu, and to be able to do the work of assigning the relative values of these things, and then jurisdictions could pick the ones that work maybe for their area, or maybe the state could put together a menu and it's based on biome or climate region, whatever it is. So I think that's great. And I guess one thing that I would suggest is maybe that in the CFAs that we need to get away from thinking about these things in terms of landscaping requirements, and focus more on green infrastructure, because a lot of these things are probably more functional than they are landscape based. That's not to say that people can't interact with them or that they can't serve a dual purpose, but I think in these areas, and a great example aside from the images that you have here, South Waterfront in Portland is a great example of how that green infrastructure is integrated into the public realm in a really engaging way, and makes you feel like you're not in as much of an urban space as you are. So but yeah, I really like the point-based system because it does allow the flexibility for different jurisdictions to take different approaches.
Pauline, one of the things that we've talked about is, our mission here is to create walkable design standards, right? And some of the options that in this particular topic area relate to creating functional green spaces, like was just mentioned, right? That have sort of a stormwater component or a water quality component or heat island mitigation component. Those could be at the ground level. They could be on the roof. They could be, in some other part of the building. And so if our mission is sort of within the bounds of walkable design standards, what is the role in urban areas in particular of these kinds of standards at the street level? And should we be thinking about the priority there somehow differently, or how can these and should they sort of stretch to enhance the pedestrian on the street, the ground level? Or is that less of a concern when we sort of balance them against all of the other public interests like stormwater, heat island, resident amenities, et cetera? AJ, see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. One of the biggest requests that we get is shade for our bus stops. And when we are siting a bus stop, we look for a location that has some kind of, I guess, arborist approved tree species shade, because we also don't want large tree canopy, because then big trucks and our buses end up running into those branches and they have to be maintained quite well. But there are trees that are specified for cityscapes that are a little bit narrower, but they still provide that shade. And it's definitely one of the, especially in the Southern Oregon area, we have a lot more sun than the Willamette Valley. And so that, I think, is extremely important for us to maintain that quality of shade. However, sometimes we've had to take out a tree because we needed to put in a concrete pad to put in the ADA accessibility that we need for our ramp systems to be able to go to our shelter. So, you know, there are times when we've needed to unfortunately remove a tree from that space. But you know, it's very seldom. So I guess I just want to throw that out there, that shade is extremely important to pedestrians. Myself, I think all of us can agree with that. But for people who are having to wait for transportation to arrive to them, it's also very important.
I would push folks a little bit more and say, you know, I'll just take your silence to mean you're all going to adopt this approach right now. Are there other questions you have, or, you know, what would you need to know if you're going to apply a points-based system or allow those public open spaces on the front of the sites to count and really emphasize them?
Steve?
I'll say that from the clear and objective perspective, I like the points-based system, or like a menu where you have this many options and then you choose this many. I don't know that necessarily needs to be a point system per se, although there are certainly different values for different things. I like that. I mean, one of the things that, like, I think in general, just going back to like the Seattle example where it's like private space, I mean, I think that there's value for private open space to the public realm. And there's also this kind of consideration that, like, when you think about like a single family house, their like contribution to open space, their front yard is private, but it still contributes to the streetscape. And in a lot of cases, like, you even have street trees that are behind the sidewalk on, you know, private property in like a street tree easement in the suburbs at least. So I guess I think, like, you know, there's also some like more macro issues of like, you know, can you require like a dedication of a public open space as part of the private development without some sort of either like offset in additional allowance or SDC credits? I mean, this is like kind of just a fundamental thing that I've always found odd, that like for apartment dwellers, we require them to have like a large amount of private open space, yet they still also pay into SDCs. And then if you build a single family home, you have no requirement to do anything in particular with your house to make it at all like usable for a recreation purpose. And so from the perspective of like, I mean, and I don't know that we necessarily hit on all of this with all of these different questions that we've walked through, but there is some like, you know, it constrains a developer to actually build a project and create like the housing in the units and bring the people that are going to activate this space. And so I guess I would just like raise that issue, not necessarily with this solution attached, but just mentioning it.
Yeah, thanks. And Phil, before I turn to you, I just want to note that that's a great question in terms of how is it offset. And I think the place that I was finding looking at specifically was San Francisco, and only in certain districts was there this allowance to do things in the public realm in order to use more of your site for. So I think it would be, you know, if you're doing something in the public realm, not on your lot, then you're getting more of your lot that can be developed for it to meet those housing goals. But yeah, really great questions. Thanks, Steve. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, and I think, and we were grappling with some of the things related to Senate Bill 1537, because they are requesting that there be, you know, adjustments for open space landscape standards. And we tend to have standards that address all of these, and they can kind of merge together, but they're also each have their own kind of separate goals. So, you know, landscaped areas, sure, you can have you know, open space, you know, private decks off of ground floor units that can factor into landscape percentages. but the landscaping area can also be your stormwater provision. But it's kind of all layered. So just providing a stormwater retention area on the off of a ground floor doesn't necessarily mean you still you're waiving the 48 square foot outdoor private deck or a common open area that might be required. So I would want to try to keep it flexible, but I just feel like that each of these have their own goals in mind. And the one other thing I just want to mention about the public realm piece, I don't know how I think other jurisdictions are very similar. From a land use perspective or a zoning perspective, once something goes into the right of way, we're not actually reviewing it on our end. It's our transportation folks, and they have their own goals and requirements for stormwater off the street and furnishing zones and things like that. So once again, if there was sort of a point-based thing, it may have to have some flexibility to kind of address that in some way or another.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Those are great points. And again, that's sort of that, if there's that guiding policy document of street types and public realm, that's already set. I think then the idea would be that the land use side of things and the transportation planning side of things would have met in advance and laid out what are those goals. So there's that coordination. But yeah, absolutely, in terms of who's reviewing, great points. Brian.
As I said earlier in the chat, I like the options and whether it's a point system or you have a certain amount of usable open space requirement and you can kind of figure out how to get there through the different options. So I think those are both strong options. As far as the specifically requiring sort of a street level or like ground level open space every time, that would make me a little nervous because there's just a lot of different situations you run into. Grades, for example, somebody's ground floor could be 8 feet below the sidewalk in some cases, on a side street, I guess, hopefully. And there are weird sites and just different programs that folks have that sometimes it's not a good idea. So it gets kind of back to the flexibility, like make it, I would be inclined to make it an option if it's a substantial like path through or substantial plaza out front requirement. That seems like a optional way to get there instead of a definitely have to do way. Not that anybody said it was a definitely have to do way. I just was kind of wanting to discuss that.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a desire to allow multiple pathways to achieve usable open space, but it could be usable from a kind of green infrastructure perspective and or usable from a sort of human perspective, could occur on different planes of the building, the ground level or otherwise. That flexibility seems to be resonating with folks, as opposed to sort of, just porting over a more limited, narrow landscape standard that gets plunked down between parking aisles in a rear parking situation, or awkwardly between the building facade and the sidewalk. I think having a little bit more thoughtfulness about where it goes and what it does is the main point. And then because we're laser focused on the walkability component, sort of wrestling with, amongst all the public policy objectives, is enhancing the pedestrian realm somehow above and beyond all those other considerations. But I think flexibility and a variety of ways to get to usability in different forms is what I'm hearing.
Great. Well, thanks for that summary, Alex. That's a good, you said the word parking, so that's really helpful. And here's some of those. buffers right now. So I think we wanted to spend a little time, so a slightly different aspect of the CFEC OAR, but I do think I want to kind of link two specific topics here, which is there's both the notion of connectivity and ease of movement, right, and from the 0330 regulations, but then there's also climate specific parking lot design for those larger parking lots in 0405. So we sort of bundled them here and want to pick your brains a little. So at issue, right, is these large parking lots that are at a citywide scale really disruptive in terms of the amount of heat that they generate. But then if you think about them at an individual human scale, very uncomfortable environments, right? To come back to your car when it's hot, to try to walk someone who's got some mobility issues through a parking lot safely, right? So that's the issue, is how if we understand that even once we've removed those parking requirements, there's still existing parking lots and there will continue to be parking lots. So what can be done to mitigate some of those issues? So we would say that the intent is to put in place standards for these larger parking lots that are emphasizing both their climate impacts, but also making them safe and comfortable spaces for people to move through, so that they're, while they're essentially auto spaces, they're not an auto dominated space. And the emphasis in the trees would be creating those larger groupings so that we're making sure that they're providing shade and adding to that tree canopy overall. So best practices, and we're going to really highlight City of Salem here. So, you know, cities are required to adopt these 0405 regulations, but we spent a little bit more time looking in depth at Salem, who's already adopted these. So first on the climate mitigation part. So there's two pathways in order to allow a larger parking lot over 1/2 acre in size to address those climate concerns. So either they can provide trees along the driveways, or they can plant trees to provide 30% canopy coverage on the site. So you can see in this first image, that's providing the trees on the site to provide canopy coverage. Now there's another option, which is to produce solar power on site. So you can see that here, there's a large solar array. There's still some landscaping within the parking lot, but really they're meeting that climate mitigation with that large solar array. Now those can be supported by going further with adopting some type of fee in lieu program. So you're dedicating those fees and then taking those fees and applying them. If someone is not able to do that on the site, you'd capture that fee and apply them to another program. City of Salem does it with their renewable energy program to do it on another offsite location, but there could also be a tree canopy planting program that you could feed those fees into. So you're all looking at and grappling with this, or you've already adopted these, but we saw some best practices here and some things to think about. So, you know, if you're going to do that fee in lieu program, it does have to, it's hard to administer it. It takes some effort, it takes some staff time, and you have to support that, and you have to have those programs in place. I think it's also important to think about the fees being set so that they're, and I might have not phrased this exactly correctly, but you want to set the fees so that they're high enough so that someone is not just easily making the choice to not provide the trees on site, right? You want to set a fee that's high enough, and you still want to make sure that they are providing some minimum amount of trees on site. So that's some things to think through. Also, I find that sometimes the driveway way to meet this, if those driveways are short, they really may be smaller planting groups of trees. So I'm not sure how much they'd be meeting that canopy goal in effect. And I think also it's important to think not just about requiring the trees, but making sure the trees are healthy once they're put on the site. So looking at those standards around the root zone and making sure the trees are healthy. And then we heard specifically from the TAC on this lack of clear and objective standards, how it's sometimes very challenging to figure out how application is or is not effectively providing connections through a parking lot and to entrances and to the street. So again, City of Salem has developed a standard, and here's the diagram from their code, and they've set some really specific minimums here in terms of the spacing of those connections. Every 4 drive aisles are 250 feet apart, and the spacing between them. So that provides some real clarity, both for those that are applying and also to those who are administering the code. I think also we would think it may be helpful to think about how to make sure those connections could be set up in a way to allow for future redevelopment and infill of those large parking lots. And that's a little bit more challenging. But a fundamental question that came to us is, by having these really these pedestrian connections that are safe for people to walk down, they're of a certain width, we may unintentionally be creating larger parking lots, which is not the CFEC goal, right? And I think there's going to be some of this tension between removing these parking requirements, but parking still being built and brought, and someone saying, well, I have to make a larger parking lot in order to meet your parking pathway standards and your tree canopy requirements. Or I can't, I have to provide too much parking, and with your spacing, I can no longer make it work on this site. So I think there's a little bit of a trade-off here, and we wanted to sort of tease you all on that. If requiring those trees and those paths can be done in a way where we still ensure that development is feasible on the site.
We save the best for last year, folks. Parking lots and navigating them and tree covering them. So expecting everyone to raise their hand all at once to jump in on this topic.
I was going to just jump in with a question. Considering that we're also putting in a bunch of standards regarding build 2 lines, you know, ensuring that there's percentage of the buildings be at the street, or, you know, we had this whole discussion earlier today about, you know, at the street within 10 feet, providing a plaza, this and that. There's things I think in the state laws that are limiting how much vehicle area you can have in the along a street frontage. I know Portland, we have that in our zoning code. I guess the question that comes up for me is do we still anticipate the type of development that you showed in the previous image, where basically all the buildings are set way back behind a parking lot, or really are we more of in the case where we've got, you know, 2 tiers of buildings, 1 tier along the street frontage there, and then another tier perhaps, or the larger box stores behind there, and then the question gets to be more about pedestrian standards and how do you link the buildings, to me, rather than exactly how do you connect to the street. So I didn't know if there's any kind of follow-up to that question.
I think that's a great question. I'm just going to put this image on the screen to help us out. And I think also Alex gets to the question that you were raising about how to allow for future infill of those parking lots, and not create unintentional ways that we're not allowing those types of connections if it's going to be infilled in the future.
So thanks for highlighting Salem. We do require connections between buildings, and we have run into the issue because so a lot of our city looks like this. We're not built all up to the street, so we are dealing with a lot of infill, redevelopment, additions. And I'm going to put a question to the side that I always ask, like, does this really all of this not apply to additions and infill? That's just a question. But we have had issues where we've had to go back to our pedestrian connections because as people infill, they're like, well, I own this little section of this bigger plaza. You can't really make me do a pedestrian connection to this other site through this other person's property, even though we function as one development site. So we've had to put in language that says essentially like what's under your control or authority or something, ownership. because it gets tricky because we have huge plazas that are just developed like this, and the pedestrian connection is a newer requirement in Salem.
I'll jump in here also with a comment. This kind of raises the question to me, or it occurs to me as I'm looking at this, that we haven't really wrestled with best practices about minimum parking requirements to begin with. There's a note in the memo about minimum, or I think like reduced or no minimum parking is assumed. But do we want to state the best practice from a walkability and climate perspective is to eliminate off-street parking mandates across the board, citywide, and not just where it's required by CFEC?
It's a good point. I don't know if I think that's a question I think best posed back to the group, and perhaps also to sort of to DLCD if you're willing to weigh in on, you know, the boundaries of this particular process vis-a-vis the larger question around on-site parking requirements.
Okay. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think the reason this is included is that we know that parking will be built in many cases, regardless of whether there are mandates or not. And so the question is just how should that be designed in an urban context? But I may not be answering the question.
Yeah, I get that developers are going to provide parking in many cases, but we as a group haven't really discussed whether minimum parking requirements to begin with is a good idea. Just as a separate best practice aside from the design standards that should apply to those parking lots, are minimum parking requirements to begin with something that we should take a stand or make sort of a best practice.
I think I agree that maybe a short discussion of the topic in the model code would be helpful, because I think some cities that aren't subject to CFEC requirements might be looking at this, and certainly parking minimums have a huge role to play in compact development. So I think I would be supportive of, you know, including, just not omitting that at all, and just like going forward with the assumption that everyone's repealed parking minimum mandates. And it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We've discussed in the previous TAC meeting all of the different elements in all the different requirements in zoning standards that impact compactness. And we did sort of skip over because it's not part of the OARs directly that we're addressing with this particular walkable design standards parking, but certainly without a doubt, on-site parking impacts compactness in a big way. And so I think it can be brought up in a way to just state the obvious. In other words, that on-site parking competes with other things happening on the site. Most importantly, building and its ability to be compact. So we can just be transparent about that.
So following up on my question, I guess what I'm curious about is looking at this site plan and then looking at one of the items in 0330, which is number 4, I believe it is. Let's see, where was that again? Was it not? Let's see. Yeah, number 4 under 4B, where it says motor vehicle parking, circulation, access, and loading may be located on site, beside, or behind buildings. Motor vehicle parking, circulation, access, and loading must not be located on site between buildings and public pedestrian facilities on or along the primary facing street. So that makes me feel like we're not supposed to allow that, a new version of that to happen. Now, as Eunice mentioned, a lot of cities, we have, hundreds of examples of existing development that looks like that. But I guess the question is, are we trying to create a model code for, updating an existing development to make it more pedestrian friendly, or is this trying to get at a new development? Because I guess I was under the impression that it would be difficult, on our corridors or centers, or pretty much any of our, probably most of our commercial mixed use areas, to propose something that looked like this. So I guess that's where I'm pushing back a little bit. Is this the right set of questions to ask in that case?
Yeah, I think this falls under that first category of what questions do you have to better understand the better practice. So Phil, I think we're going to take your questions, and we'll circle back with DLCD to get a little more clarity around this topic for the group. And I'm going to apologize. I know, Paige, you've had your hand up for a while, but we are at time. So if you want to drop any comments or questions you have in the chat. But this is also a great time to remind everyone, we're always open to any additional questions or input you want to provide. This is a lot of information. We'll make sure that you have access to the slides and you have the recording. But please always feel free to reach out and email the project team with any additional thoughts you have. Just a quick snapshot here of where we're headed next. You'll see us again at TAC 5 sometime in September. We'll be starting to get into a little bit more detail about our actual approach and working through with you all about what's the most important level of guidance and on what topics. And then we'll actually be spending over the next couple of weeks reaching out to stakeholders with some of these same best practices to gauge from them what could be some stumbling blocks from their perspective. So thanks very much, everybody, for your time. Thanks for the lively discussion, and appreciate all of your participation. And we will see you at our next TAC. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.